Colombia votes today in a presidential runoff, and this is probably the biggest election happening in the world this week. The race is between Iván Cepeda, a left wing senator backed by the movement of outgoing President Gustavo Petro, and Abelardo De la Espriella, a right wing lawyer and businessman who has basically run his campaign on crime, order, and getting far away from Petro as possible. And what makes this race interesting is that a few weeks ago, it didn't really feel like De la Espriella was guaranteed to be in this position. Colombia uses a two-round presidential system, so if nobody gets over 50% of the vote in the first round, the top two candidates go to a runoff. And in the first round, a lot of the coverage still made it feel like Cepeda was the candidate to beat. He was the face of the left, he had the Petro machine behind him, and for a while it looked like he could finish first. But that's not what happened. Before we start, my name is Nick, and you're watching This Week in Elections. De La Espriella came out on top with around 43.8% of the vote. Cepeda finished second with around 40.9%, and then everybody else was way behind. Paloma Valencia from the Democratic Center got just under 7%, so De La Espriella didn't just barely make the runoff, he beat Cepeda in round one and did better than a lot of people expected. And he showed that the anti Pedro vote was already moving behind him before the runoff even started. And that matters even more so now, because round two is just him and Cepeda. There's no more crowded field, no traditional right wing candidate splitting the vote, no centrist candidate trying to sneak through the middle. It's just the Petro aligned left against the candidate who's become the main face of the backlash to Petro. And to understand why that backlash to Petro exists, you have to go back to 2022. That year, Gustavo Petro became Colombia's first modern left wing president, and that was a huge deal. Colombia has usually been one of the more conservative countries in South America. It had close ties with the United States, a long history of center right and right wing politics, and decades of conflict that shaped almost everything about the country's political system. So when Petro won, it felt like Colombia was trying something very different than it usually had. He promised more social spending, more action on inequality, a greener economy, and a policy he called total peace. That was his plan to negotiate not just with the guerrilla troops, but also with the armed groups and criminal organizations still active in parts of Colombia. And to his supporters, that made sense. Colombia has dealt with violence, poverty, inequality, drug trafficking, and a weak state in rural areas for decades. Pedro was supposed to be a break from the old way of doing things. But 4 years later, a lot of voters are frustrated. Pedro's supporters would say he inherited huge problems and that Congress blocked a lot of what he wanted to do. And they would say that, one president cannot fix Colombia in one term. While his critics would say something, very different. They'd say he overpromised, picked too many fights, scared off investors, and failed to get control of the security situation. And that's really the crux of the issue that has dominated this campaign, which is security. Colombia is not back in the worst years of its conflict, but that doesn't mean people feel safe. Armed groups are still active in parts of the country, drug trafficking is still a major problem, extortion is still a major problem, and in some rural areas, like I said, the government still does not have full control. So when Pedro talks about negotiation and peace, some voters hear patience and reform while others hear weakness. And that's the space that De La Espriella has really stepped into. His campaign is, not subtle. His supporters call him El Tigre or the Tiger, and he has leaned into that whole, kind of tough guy, hard on crime image. His basic message is that Colombia is in crisis, the state has lost control, and the answer is not another round of negotiations. The answer is order. He has talked about building mega prisons, strengthening the military, cracking down on armed groups, and ending those peace talks with groups that refuse to surrender. Economically, he also wants a pretty sharp break from Petro. He supports lower taxes, a smaller state, more private investment, restarting oil exploration, and allowing fracking. So for voters who are tired of Petro, De La Espriella gives them a very clear option: less negotiation, more force, less state intervention, more business, less Petro, basically. And Cepeda is making the opposite case. He's not really running away from Petro. He's trying to keep that political project alive. Cepeda has been in Colombian politics for years. He's a senator and he's known for his work on human rights, victims of the conflict, and peace issues. His argument is that Colombia should not abandon the left after just one term. He wants to continue peace talks, expand social programs, support poor and elderly Colombians, and keep pushing a more socially focused economic model. And there is still a real audience for that. Petro did not win in 2022 by accident. Millions of Colombians still want more redistribution, more social spending, and a government that does not just respond to every security problem with the army. Cepeda can also say that De la Espriella is making Colombia's problems sound way easier than they actually are, because building prisons and sending in troops might sound strong on paper, but Colombia's armed groups are tied into drug routes, illegal mining, local economies, corruption, and places where the state has been weak for years. So Cepeda's warning is that a hard right crackdown could create new problems, especially in a country with Colombia's history. The problem is that, give this project more time is a tough pitch to people when they already feel disappointed. And that is why the first round was such a big moment. It showed that De La Espriella has already become the main anti-Pedro candidate. The traditional right was pushed into third place. The center, like I said, barely made an impact, and the runoff is a clear fight between Petro's left and a hard and aggressive right. That also fits into a much larger pattern that we've been seeing in Latin America. Crime has become one of the most powerful political issues in the region. The clearest example is in El Salvador, where you have Bukele, who became incredibly popular at home after launching massive crackdowns on gangs and, his mega prisons. And, but human rights groups have heavily criticized what he's done. But politically, the conversation really hasn't changed. A lot of voters see him and think, at least he restored order. And a lot of politicians across the continent see that and think that's, the message that works with the voters. And you see that in the politics in Colombia as well now. De la Espriella is not running as a technocrat. He's running as a guy who says the left failed, the country's too unsafe, and Colombia needs someone willing to be much tougher. We also just saw that in Peru, which just had its second round in the presidential election, and that race also became very polarized between the left versus the right. Keiko Fujimori, running from the right with a strong law and order message, has been trying to return to power in a country that has gone through years of political chaos. So, since she won, and if Peru moves right, which they did, and Colombia elects De La Espriella, that would be two major South American countries shifting in similar directions within a short period of time. And while that doesn't mean the whole continent is suddenly moving right, Brazil is still led by Lula. Chile has been, back and forth. Argentina already made a huge rightward turn with Javier Milei. And every country has its own story, but the left wing wave that looked so strong many years ago is clearly running into trouble. Voters are angry about crime, inflation, weak growth, corruption, and governments that promise big changes but struggle to deliver them. Colombia fits that mold pretty well. Petro came in promising transformation, and De La Espriella is now running as the reaction to it. And going into Sunday, De La Espriella looks like the favorite. He finished first in round one and has the momentum, and the remaining anti-Pedro vote has an obvious place to go. But Cepeda is not out of it. He needs strong turnout from the left, he needs to hold Pedro's coalition together, and he needs voters who are uneasy about the De La Espriella to see him as too risky. That's really the only choices now. Cepeda is asking voters to give the left one more time, and De La Espriella is asking voters to end the Petro era after just one term. And if De La Espriella wins, Colombia will take a sharp turn on security, the economy, and its place in the region. If Cepeda wins, it would be a huge comeback for the Latin American left, and a sign that Petro's movement still has more life in it than people once thought. Either way, it's a pretty big test of where South American politics is heading right now, and after Peru's second round win for the right, Colombia might be the next sign that the region's political mood is shifting once again. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to leave a like, comment, subscribe, and let me know who you're rooting for today and if you're going to go out and vote.